Let us lay aside every weight and the sin which doth so easily beset us, and let us run with patience the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Sabbath sermon from the People's Christian Church. Just a few announcements. We're still having our Wednesday evening Zooms for members that would like to join us. And again, you just have to let me know and I'll send you the link and you can join us on Wednesday evenings. Usually we spend the first 10 or 15 minutes just talking with each other, and then for the rest of the time it's a small message that I might have for you. So that's Wednesday evenings at 7. Also, in a couple weeks, it is Pentecost, so my plan at the moment is on May 31st at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, which is when we usually do it. If I decide on a different time, I will let you know. I will give you a Pentecost message, so that's May 31st, and it's a Sunday afternoon. And I really think that's it for announcements, so let's get right into the message. We are in Romans 13 now. We did part of it already, and I'm going to read, to start us off, verses 7 through 14 of Romans chapter 13. Render therefore to all their dues, tribute to whom tribute is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. Owe no man anything but to love one another, for he that loveth another hath fulfilled the law. For this, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness, thou shalt not covet. And if there be any other commandment, it is briefly comprehended in this saying, namely, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Love worketh no ill to his neighbor, therefore love is the fulfilling of the law. And that, knowing the time, that now it is high time to awake out of sleep, for now is our salvation nearer than when we believed. The night is far spent, the day is at hand. Let us therefore cast off the works of darkness, and let us put on the armor of light. Let us walk honestly as in the day, not in rioting and drunkenness, not in chambering and wantonness, not in strife and envying. But put ye on the Lord Jesus Christ, and make not provision for the flesh to fulfill the lusts thereof. And may God add his blessing to this reading from his holy word. So last week we looked at the beginning of Romans chapter 13, where we're told basically that we need to respect our governments, no matter whether or not we agree with what they're saying, and because they are put in power by God for some reason. Sometimes we don't understand why, but they are there for a reason. And so we are to respect the offices of our government, whether or not we agree with them. And I had challenged everybody not to comment on, or not themselves to throw up memes or negative things about our government, either side, whether you're conservative or liberal or right in the middle. I had asked you to stay away from that as a respect to those in leadership. And hopefully you did that. So we're going further on in the chapter, and we're starting really with verse 5. And it talks about that we need to be subject because of wrath, and also for a conscience sake. So what does that mean? Well, these verses pretty much summarize verses 1 through 4, again saying that we must obey or be subject to rulers, and two reasons are given. And the reasons are because of wrath, and that sort of doesn't make sense unless you look at it in the whole context, and then for consciousness sake. So what do they mean here when they say wrath? Well, this refers back to verse 4. And we were told in verse 4 that the rulers, the government that we are under, are the avenger of wrath. They have the power to punish evil. We know that we have court systems that do that. There are certain things that they can do, like fines and imprisonment. And some people think that this is all there is. If you get caught, the rulers punish you, and that's the end of it. And then the only penalty is whatever consequence that comes upon you at the hand of the rulers. And that would be fine if that's all you believed and you were not a Christian. But if that's the case, there would be really no reason to obey if you thought you weren't going to get caught. And oftentimes that's the way people think. Everything's okay until they get caught. So God gives us a second reason in which we should obey. And we obey not just because of what the government can do to evildoers, which is the wrath part of it, the punishment inflicted by the rulers, but that conscience part is referring to our standing before God. Conscience is that part of the mind that tells us whether or not we are doing right or wrong. And it is certainly guided by God's law. And this is, really, this is part of one of the reasons why you should be reading the Bible, so you know exactly what it is you're supposed to be doing and what it is you're not supposed to be doing. And so that you can understand, you can also claim your blessings if you know what they are. So the point here is that God's law instructs us basically to obey the civil law also. He has specific laws, but most of the time they fall under civil laws fall under God's laws. So we cannot have a pure conscience toward God if we are disobeying the rulers of our time. In the New Testament, in 1 Peter chapter 2, looking at verses 13 through 15, we read, "Submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether it be to the king as supreme, or unto governors, as unto them that are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers, and for the praise of them that do well. For so is the will of God, that with well doing ye may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men." And then verse 17, "Honor all men, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king." So we're told in more places than Romans, and actually quite a few places, and as you know, I never give you all the text because it would take far too long, but we are told many places in the Bible that we're to follow the rulers of our generation. And it says it because it's for the Lord's sake and for the will of God. That is because he commanded it. And this is equivalent to the phrase "for conscience sake." So one who violates civil law is also violating divine law, because God commands civil obedience. He does not condone civil disobedience. And the only time in which we should not follow the laws of the land is if it goes against God's law. So there are some specific examples of law that we should be obeying, but some people, probably including me, justify disobeying. And those would include traffic laws, building codes, drug laws. Sometimes if you're protesting something, it might be rioting and looting, and of course paying taxes. We none of us really enjoy that part of our civic duty in paying taxes. And that goes on to what the rest of these verses say in Romans, when he says in verse 7, "Render therefore to all their dues." So this really is talking about paying taxes. Government is doing a work ordained by God, so it is only right and fitting that Christians should pay taxes to support the government. After all, we certainly do reap the benefits of it. There are many other passages in the Bible, in Matthew, in Mark, and in Luke, all of these mostly from the words of Jesus, that talk about this. So this, when it says "for because of this," implies that people should pay taxes because of what has already been said, that rulers are servants of God. They are punishing over evildoers for the protection of those of us that are good, and they do a work that God has ordained. So as a good person, then you should be willing to do your part to support it, just as churches, or I shouldn't really say churches, just as God asks you to pay your tithes, it is supporting the work of the church. And so we have tithes that we should pay to the church, and we have taxes which we should pay to the government. And we are supporting the government because God said to, and because it does a work for God. It keeps peace in the land. It keeps us safe, and it keeps evil people where they should be. And some people would say to this, but some governments are evil and they do things that we know are wrong. And of course, if we realize that, obviously God knows that too. He knows that governments would sometimes do evil, but he still said you should be paying your taxes. And as Paul comes to the end of this discussion of civil rulers in this chapter, he generalizes the principles in verse 6, and he makes a transition to more general topics. He has said to pay taxes to support the government for the good it does, and then he proceeds to show that we should give what is due to all. The immediate application here is to rulers, but the principle applies in general. And he actually lists specific areas in which we should be paying what is due. The first thing he talks about is taxes, or another word that is used is tribute. And this refers mainly to money paid by an occupied country to the government that it was under. And we know that this was happening in the time of Paul. The Romans ruled the area, and so they were having to pay taxes to actually a foreign government. And obviously they resented it. But this was why the question was asked in Matthew and then again in Luke to Jesus, because they were trying to trap him. They asked if they should be paying these taxes to this foreign government. And that's when he said the words, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. And then we also see here the word custom. And of course, this probably meant like sort of what we pay, which I think are called tariffs now, a tax on imported or exported merchandise. And again, this shows that we should be paying taxes regardless of the form or manner in which it's levied. And then here we see the word fear, and oftentimes this word is misunderstood in the Bible. It really doesn't ever really mean you're afraid of something, but this fear usually refers to respect, which it does here also, in that it refers to the respect that we ought to give to those in authority, especially to the civil rulers, because of the powers they have, that they can do what they're supposed to do to keep you safe. So again, nothing here in any of this says that we should ignore the government corruption or personal immorality of the lives of rulers. It doesn't mean we give them a free pass to do what they want. Sin is going to be rebuked wherever it is found, whether it is in high places of government or as citizens of the country. But we have to respect the fact that these people have real power from God, and we must continue to obey them despite their corruption, of course, unless they command us to sin. This honor that we're told to give is really a sense of appreciation for the value of the work that they do. Their work serves certainly a necessary purpose, which benefits all of us, and this really does deserve our appreciation. We know that many times our government officials do give up a lot of their own lives to rule for us. So though the application that we're reading here applies immediately to rulers, the same principle applies to all who do service and render useful work on our behalf, such as police officers, firemen, etc. We should value that work and show appreciation for it. And the verse begins by telling us to render to all their due. And we may owe money or service to various people for various reasons. We may have incurred debt in various ways. I don't really know anybody, I'm sure there are a few, but I don't really know anybody that have bought their house outright without incurring a mortgage. You may have to borrow something in order to buy it, but for whatever reason that we owe a debt to anyone, we're expected also to be responsible to pay for it. And this goes on in verses 8 through 10. And he starts out in verse 8 by saying, "Owe no man." And what does that mean? You may owe many things besides money. And this word here, it generally refers to something we are obligated to do for others. And this passage shows that we should fulfill the obligations that we have, whether it is in doing something or it is in actually paying back something that we might have borrowed. Some obligations can be fulfilled and they are relieved and you're no longer subject to them. So, for instance, let's say I asked to borrow $10 from you and you gave it to me, and then the next week I gave you back the $10. My obligation has been fulfilled. You gave me the money, I repaid it. But there are certain things that we cannot repay, and we're getting to that as we go along here. And if you promise to do something for someone, let's say I said to you, I'm going to call you next week to see how you're doing, and then I do call you, then I have paid that debt of something that I have fulfilled, something that I said I would do. Now, if I say I'll call you next week and I don't call you, then I really do still owe you that debt. So we have to make sure if we promise to do something for someone that we fulfill the obligation at the appointed time that we have set. We should not leave obligations unfulfilled, but we should accomplish what we committed ourselves to do and so relieve ourselves of the debt. And of course, in taking out loans or in charging on our credit cards, we should always make sure that we know what we charge, we can afford, and we can pay for. We shouldn't expect others to incur our debt because we have been irresponsible. So that's important for us to remember, especially as Christians, because again, as I've said many times, we are the ones that people should be looking to for how they should live their lives. So now we move on to verses 8 through 14, and it's here he's talking about love for others and the proper conduct that we should have. We may, for example, promise to pay someone in the future for a service or a product given to us today. If so, we do not owe that person in the sense used here until the time comes when we are promised to pay. So it's not considered owing if you are, even though you do owe the money, but it's not considered a negative, I should say, if, for instance, with your mortgage, that you are actually paying your mortgage payments on time every month. You're doing what you're supposed to, and you do that for the entire length of the loan. Then you are meeting your obligations. We are not obliged to pay before the appointed time. If you have a 30-year mortgage, God's not saying to you, well, you need to get that done in 15. We have fulfilled our obligation as long as we make sure we pay it back. So I know there are some denominations that feel that borrowing is wrong, but the passage here is not forbidding us to borrow or making of debts, but it is telling us here that we shouldn't try to beat a debt, that we shouldn't try to get out of paying what we what we should pay. We shouldn't use the excuse that, well, I charge things and I shouldn't have, because we should spend our resources on things that we need, not on things that we want. And when the time comes to pay, we can't claim that we're not able to pay. In many times, I've seen circumstances where, people have a hard time paying their mortgage or a hard time paying their rent, but they still have all the premium channels on their TV. Well, it doesn't help you to have a wonderful series of shows to watch if you have no place to live. So you have to remember what's important and what you need, not necessarily what you want. And again, you have to make sure you are obliged and responsible to pay for what you have bought in your life. Now, there is one exception to this in owing, and that is in the fact that we are expected to love one another. This is the exception to the general rule that we should not owe obligations we cannot fulfill. Because unlike the debts that were previously mentioned, which really mostly had to do with money and or time or committing to do something, this is one thing that we can never fulfill to release ourselves from this debt. By its nature, this debt, and the debt I'm talking about is loving one another, it will continue for all of our lives. We must continually act according to the obligation we have that love imposes on us No matter how much love that we show someone or show a group of people, we can never ever retire that debt. We can love more. We can love for a lengthy period of time. So this obligation is a fulfillment of the command to love our neighbor. We can love our neighbor today and so fulfill the law. But it doesn't stop today. We're going to be obligated to love again tomorrow. It doesn't stop because we did it today. So from here, Paul proceeds to show that love will lead to fulfilling all of God's law, not just the law to pay our debts. We know that love is an active goodwill towards others. To love it's a verb. You need to be active and show that you actually love. It is a commitment to the well-being of others that leads us to want what is best for them. And this is the purpose of God's law. And it is defined certainly in a way that, in His Word, that is totally understandable. In 1 Corinthians 13, it is known as the love chapter, and it's read oftentimes at weddings. And so I'm going to read verses 1 through 8 from 1 Corinthians 13. Though I speak with the tongues of men and angels and have not love, I am become as a sounding brass or a tinkling cymbal. And though I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have all faith so that I could remove mountains and have not love, I am nothing. And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned and have not love, it profiteth me nothing. Love suffereth long and is kind. Love envieth not. Love vaunteth not itself, is not puffed up, doth not behave itself unseemly, seeketh not her own, is not easily provoked, thinketh no evil, rejoiceth not in iniquity, but rejoiceth in the truth, beareth all things, believeth all things, hopeth all things, endureth all things. Love never fails. And now abideth faith, love, and charity, these things, but the greatest of these is love. So we see here we really have a good definition of love. And as you read in those verses, you see that you're putting the other person first. You're not taking this idea of love and feeling that it's what you do and you want everybody to see that you do it. You do it in the background. You do it because it is right. You do it because that's part of who you are. And it appears here that Paul has left a discussion specifically of civil rulers out of this loving, and he's really talking about how we treat each other. Yes, we have governments that we have to follow, but the whole idea of a country starts with its citizens. And so as citizens of a country, we have to make ourselves good neighbors. And as good neighbors, of course, that means specifically to the people that live near you, but more generally, it means to anyone that you come in contact with. You need to have a love for everybody, even, and I guess even more so for people that are sort of annoying to you. And then Paul goes on to list several specific examples of commands that love will lead us to obey. And as I read this, I'm hoping that you recognize that these sins that he was talking about here are directly from the Old Testament and specifically from the Ten Commandments. And these are found in verse 9. And he starts out with, thou shalt not commit adultery. So we know that adultery is a sexual unfaithfulness involving people, one of whom at least is married to someone else. We know that adultery is often based on selfishness and something that someone wants, not caring about the commitment that they've made. It usually harms many people. If there's children involved, it certainly harms them more than anyone else. It damages marriage relationships, and it certainly is a sin against God. It's a specific sin that he tells us we shouldn't do. And this is this idea of committing adultery is so negative to God that this is actually the only grounds that is given for divorce in the Bible. In Matthew chapter 19, uh, he tells us that this is a reason for divorce. And it's certainly, if you are committing adultery, it is not showing the love that you were committed to at the very beginning. The next commandment he mentions is, "Thou shalt not kill." Now we know that this refers to murder, and murder is, of course, the taking of the life of another human being. We know that people are made in God's image, and therefore killing a person, regardless of their age or physical condition, is sinful. Others have as much right to live as we do, so killing someone is not doing good, and it certainly is unloving. We would not want others to do it to us, so we ought not to do it to anyone else. And this certainly is a command that love teaches us to obey. So we've looked at 2 of the 10 commandments here: thou shalt not commit adultery, and thou shalt not kill. The next one that we see is, thou shalt not steal. Stealing is taking what belongs to others without their permission. And this covers a lot of different areas, because it sort of goes back to what Paul said earlier, in that when we owe taxes to our government, regardless of whether we agree how we're taxed, that we should pay those taxes. And so when you're filling out your income tax form every year, you shouldn't try to cheat the government of what they say is owed to them. That is also a form of stealing. So this makes sense that he is mentioning this specific commandment here. And he also goes on to say that thou should not bear false witness. Now, this is not found in all translations. Some translations it's not included in, but in the King James Version, which is what we use, it is included. So we know that bearing false witness is lying. And oftentimes when you are covering up your sins, then you are certainly probably going to lie about it. And so this is certainly a good one to include here. And then the last one that he talks about as a commandment is coveting, or he says, thou shalt not covet. And coveting is greed or love of money, which leads us to a desire to either take what belongs to others, or to want it so bad that we might not be the loving person we should to that person. It comes in things like envy and selfishness, cheating in business. And anytime we take what belongs to another person against his will and without being willing to return for fair value, we are either stealing or being dishonest. And we can even take someone's reputation, so we have to be careful about that. Again, we should not want others to do to us what would be unloving, so we shouldn't do it to them. And likewise, many other commands are summed up in the command as he goes on in this chapter, where he says to love thy neighbor as thyself. And I'm going to close for this afternoon with a couple of verses from 1 John chapter 5. And I'm going to look at verses 2 and 3. So this is 1 John chapter 5. But this we know, that we love the children of God, when we love God and keep his commandments. For this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments, and his commandments are not grievous. So as we went through the beginning of Romans chapters 1 through 11, we often talked about the fact that we had to have faith, but it was an obedient faith. And so this is a reminder here from those previous chapters that love involves following rules, and that we need to remember to do that. And the rules that we need to follow, of course, are God's laws. So we're going to end today with this. We'll pick it up again next week. We're going to be talking more about this love that he wants us to have one for another. And I think it's certainly very important in the days we're living in, when we need to be looking out for one another and taking care of each other. So I want to thank you for listening in this afternoon. I hope that this message enlightened you and gave you hope for the week. Remember to, if you promise to do something for someone, that you actually do it. And I do ask that you try to do something for someone this week to show the love. Remember, love is an action verb. You need to love, not just feel love. So do something for someone else this week as a result of this message. As always, I'm going to close in a word of prayer. So have on your heart someone or something that you feel needs help at this moment. It could be somebody that's sick. It could be somebody that's mourning. We know that it's really, especially at this time, being very difficult for people to lose loved ones because you can't go through the same procedures that you ordinarily would have in planning a funeral and so forth. So we need to keep those people in mind. We need especially to keep in mind the people that are taking care of us in hospitals and nursing homes, and the people that are in nursing homes, and of course the first responders that always putting themselves on the line for others. So let's go to God in prayer. Heavenly Father, this afternoon we thank you for the opportunity to hear your word. We know that it is important in these days to understand that we can help each other out because of the love that you give us. And the fact of the matter is that love that you give us fills us to the brim, overflows from us, and because of that we are able to share it with others. We ask this week that you give us the opportunity to find a way to share that love with someone else, whether it be with our time, whether it be with a message or help financially, whatever the case may be. Help us to show that love that you have for us to others. Help others want to emulate what you have done for us. I thank you for your goodness and mercy and your many blessings. As always, I ask special blessings on those that are sick, those that mourn, those with financial difficulties, but especially this afternoon on the things that everyone is holding on their heart. You know their need. You know the time in which their prayer should be answered. Help us to have patience to wait for the answer, and help us to accept the answer that you have given us, because we know sometimes we often think we know best, but when we look back, we know that if we listened to you, our lives would have gone so much smoother. I ask special blessings on our governments, both local and national, protection for our president and his family, and protection for our service personnel throughout the world. Also for protection, wisdom, and patience on our first responders, volunteers, and those that are working with the public. We know that they are oftentimes in a little bit of danger nowadays, more than usual, and so we ask that you be with them, watch over them, take care of them, and bless them. And we thank you that we have been given this opportunity to spread your word, to praise you, to thank you, and to be in awe of all that you give to us each and every day. In your Son's name, amen. And to close, God is good all the time.